In Europe, we are facing a dire situation where the largest war since 1945 is raging in Ukraine with absolutely devastating consequences. And probably one of the factors that you were talking about on the doomsday clock, I'm guessing. In this war, a nuclear-armed NATO and a nuclear-armed Russia are in direct military conflict with all the risks of that. But instead of taking steps to bring this war to an end, the US, Britain, and NATO are escalating it. Why, in your opinion, is NATO escalating this war instead of pushing for peace? And in your view, what is a realistic pathway for peace?
Well, that's the big question. That's the really big question facing us today. And just very briefly, I'm sure everyone who's watching this who lives in Britain will have been absolutely appalled by the really bad negative role played by our government earlier on in the war. And I think people will probably remember that Boris Johnson, who was Prime Minister at that time, became revealed that he had actively sabotaged the possibility of peace talks. So Britain, although we're not by any means the biggest player or the biggest military actor in this, the way in which Britain has given kind of political support to this terrible war and the continuation of this terrible war, I think is really, really deeply shocking. In terms of the wider picture, well, first of all, just to say something about NATO, because NATO, although it's North Atlantic Treaty Organization, supposedly, it's the United States, it's Canada and European states. Most European states are member states. But even though it claims that it has that kind of wider membership and it's trying to pull in countries from other parts of the world now as well, in reality, it's just a kind of an extension of US foreign and military policy. And it's been quite interesting to see how in the last few years, the Americans have really tried to get Europe to ramp up its military spending, to in excess of 2% of GDP. But the reality is whoever is a member on paper, they are being led by US goals. I suppose in terms of what are the US goals, I always find it incredibly useful to actually look back quite a long way, but I think it still holds true. At the end of the Cold War, the United States looked at the world and what was going on, and they saw that they were the single superpower and they liked it. Basically, they'd spent the whole period since the end of the Second World War trying to knock out the Soviet Union. Now that has happened, and they wanted just to stay top dog. And this is enshrined in a document at that time, which became known as the Wolfowitz Doctrine in 1992, I think it was, very soon after the end of the Cold War. Peace movement people, normal, sensible people were saying, look, the Warsaw Pact has ended. That was, Soviet equivalent of NATO. So let's just get rid of NATO, have a new world order of peace. We can have a peace dividend and stop spending so much money on weapons and so on. But no, the United States wanted to continue with NATO and continue along the Wolfowitz lines, which is essentially we will do whatever is necessary, the US will do whatever is necessary to remain the single superpower. And I think in the 30-odd years that have followed that is exactly what they have done. I think it's pretty clear that still shapes what they're doing. And of course, today, as we know, their main concern, the main kind of what they kind of set up as a rival is, of course, China, essentially a kind of fast developing economy, doing very well in terms of bringing its people out of terrible poverty and hardship, so they want to obviously keep China down. En route, would be quite happy to knock out Russia as well. I mean, they pretty much knocked it out through their economic policies, IMF economic policies in the 1990s. It's come back somewhat through the development of its economy and so on. So now they're quite happy to use military methods to try and knock Russia out of the kind of the game, the big power game as well. And they've done that primarily by the expansion of NATO. So from the 90s onwards, from 1999, when they had first wave of NATO expansion into Eastern Europe, there have been subsequent waves ever since. So now former Soviet republics, the Baltic states, they are now members of NATO and so on. So this has obviously concerned Russia. I mean, how anyone could look at a map and see all this and also the US bases and not understand what that global dynamic is, I do not know. Maybe people don't like looking at maps, but obviously they've had Russia as a focus in terms of the role of NATO, particularly during the kind of first 20 years after the end of the Cold War. Of course, subsequently, they tried to go global, getting partner organizations, partner countries, I should say, in Latin America and elsewhere involved. But that kind of focus on keeping Russia down and preventing China coming up, that's pretty much US foreign policy in a nutshell. And that is the NATO agenda too. And Britain's, of course, as well, as US number one ally tailing along there.